if I know the occupancy and the use of things like desks or meeting rooms or any other kind of area, then I can better understand the likelihood of needing to actually clean that area. If I've got sensors on my bins, I can better understand the fill rate of bins and so on, and I can respond to that. Equally, even as an example, if I just know that there is actually a thermal issue in an area, I may not be able to predict what the activity is that I need to do to solve that issue, but I'm at least aware of it before I get a tenant complaint. So there's a few different categories there of being able to say, I definitely know that there's an activity that needs to be done. It's cleaning, it's bin emptying, it's addressing a thermal issue or similar. I can also start to see patterns, and again, coming back to building analytics, I can see scenarios where perhaps equipment is degrading. That may predict that there's a failure, or just again, it may not be an absolute failure. It may be that there's a filter that needs changing, or perhaps there's a valve that's stuck open, things like that. So I can go and I can look and I can address those kind of issues. So yes, definitely that kind of capability is starting to come to the fore. But the really important thing to remember is, in the vast majority of cases, these solutions don't fix the problem themselves. You have to integrate it to your workflow. You have to integrate it to the whatever contracts you have in place, be that cleaning, be that your BMS maintenance cycle, be that, whatever other aspect. Because if you have alerts, but you have no person to respond to them or no mechanism for that work to be instructed, you're not much better off than when you didn't know about them.
Cool. Hey, Pete, welcome to the Digital Construction Podcast. It's great to have you here.
Likewise, Andrea, great to be here.
It's amazing. So today we have Pete Swanson, who is the digital technology lead at Mott MacDonald. He also has a lot of experience. He previously worked at WSP and Lendlease. He has been supporting the digital construction industry for a long time. I met him at a conference a few years ago, talking about digital construction, and I've learned a lot from the things he has shared, because he is very passionate supporter of the digital construction industry, and he's always happy to share his knowledge. So I'm very excited to have you here, Pete. But before we start, could you share with us a little bit of your career journey and what led you to work in the digital technology space and the construction industry?
Yeah, of course, Andrea. So I started my career back in the last millennium, quite a while ago now, and that was in audiovisual. So I always had an interest in technologies. I actually started in theatre in high school, so lighting and sound and so on. And that flowed kind of naturally into an interest in audiovisual systems and technologies and the way that people use them, whether to entertain, to educate, as part of their business and so on. And I guess, back then, the technology was really very basic compared to what we have today. Some might remember that we used to have these enormous projectors, and they had 3 tubes. We called them 3-gun projectors, one red, one green, one blue. It was very much an analog world, even in the sense of electronics, no networking, etc. But what you could already see was that people had a passion for wanting the tech to work well for them. And unfortunately, very often, either because of limitations of the tech or the way the systems were designed or the way that people were trained on them, that wasn't always delivered. And so that really was kind of the outset for me, this interest in how do you deliver really great solutions for people, where they work, where they learn, where they're being entertained. And through the lens of audiovisual, I really started to get exposure to that, and I guess then a passion for the extension of that into, not just the audiovisual in the room, but, the lighting, the blinds, perhaps controlling the air conditioning and so on. And that was the journey for me through into what today is the smart buildings industry. Through that time, I started out as a contractor, so I very much understand the reality of what happens on site, whether that's about the difficulty of, actually installing equipment, the long hours, whatever else, and the hard work to make something actually come into existence as a system. But I also, I guess, as a contractor, could see that there was opportunities to do things better early in the process. So I was very lucky while I was working in the UK to actually work for Goldman Sachs for a year as part of their AV design team. And that gave me my first real view of, I suppose, the difference between the client perspective of what they wanted versus maybe the contractor's perspective. Moving here to Australia in 2002, I worked initially for, again, a systems integrator, but again, I could see this opportunity just to try and help to scope things better so that the client's expectations were better met and the outcomes were delivered more reliably by the contractor. So I joined a consulting firm in 2004, what eventually became WSP here in Australia, and set up an audiovisual team, which then also grew into technology integration and so on. So that was a real passion for me. I was also passionate along the way about really being able to focus on certain tech. So I spent time with a leading audiovisual and integration company, a vendor, manufacturer, AMX, which became acquired by Harman, and really had an opportunity there to kind of focus on those systems, but also focus on how to support the value chain. And I guess that started to give me perspectives as well on the realities of deploying tech at scale into the built environment, and the fact that not everything works all the time. You know, when you're in the business, providing the distribution, providing the support, you come to understand that inevitably some things fail. And it's not about whether things fail, it's about the ability to support them. Moving on from there, my sort of next part of the arc was moving into the property construction development space, working for Lendlease for 5 years. And again, for me, that was very much about, I guess, the opportunity for that integrated view. You know, so often, depending on what role we play in the industry, you know, if we're the consultant, we have a certain perspective. If we're the contractor, we have certain involvement, the distributor, and so on. But when you're in an integrated business like Lendlease, you can really get a fuller view of the whole process and the operational side of things. And I will say that's always been a passion for me. You know, while it's very important that we build effectively and we use the best tools to actually construct environments, for me, what's important is what happens after we hand them over. So the operational phase, and really making sure that the tech we deploy is effective, is realistic to support, both in terms of reliability, cost, and so on, and is delivering genuine benefit. So during my time at Lendlease, I was lucky to work in some of the emerging digital areas. We were looking at ways to develop solutions for smart workplaces, smart buildings from an analytics perspective in terms of getting data out of the buildings and then providing insights and helping people to optimize the way they were, you know, occupying those buildings as tenants or, you know, operating them from an owner perspective. Well, one of the things I realized was that the industry is very complex, as I already knew, but also very much still emerging. There's a lot of challenges in how we define projects, how we scope them, how we deliver them. And that's what brought me back to where I am again at the moment, which is consulting. So I like to say, you know, I've sat in most of the seats around the table, so I guess I can give a reasonable perspective on what's likely to happen at each stage of the project, what may or may not be realistic, and also how we can get the best out of each part of the project team by helping them to be able to do what they do really well and not putting them in a situation where, you know, they're trying to deliver something that, you know, wasn't really very natural or wasn't very achievable. So, yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you, Pete, for the introduction. I always enjoy to listen to how different people end up working in the digital space for the construction industry, and really appreciate how we all came here in different ways from different angles, and that also proves the skills that are required to be part of this transformation. Like, it's not just one thing that you need to know. There is so much going on. But yeah, thank you for the introduction. Today we're talking about smart buildings and smart cities, and as you can see, Pete is the right person to talk about that. But before we start, we understand that there are so many buzzwords in this industry. Smart buildings may feel like one of those. Pete, can you tell us what makes a building smart?
Well, I can tell you that for a number of years it caused me to physically cringe when people said smart building, because you're right, you know, that we have so many buzzwords. We contend with the hype cycle all the time. You know, a lot of the technologies that we use are somewhere up towards the peak of the hype cycle, or they've, you know, gone into the trough and heading towards the plateau of productivity. But smart buildings, I guess, is actually for me kind of settling into the market. You know, the term's been around for quite a while, but I think now we're starting to understand collectively that a smart building is actually really a concept. It's not one thing. You can't just go out and buy a smart building, as it were. But what you can do is recognize that when we're talking about a smart building, we're talking about an aspiration to deliver really great experiences and performance and sustainable outcomes by using technology in a building. So, in a nutshell, for me, that's what a smart building is. But of course, depending on what kind of environment we're talking about, be it a hospital, be it a stadium, university, government institution, corporate environment, transport hub, whatever it might be, there's going to be variance on that definition of what smart means. So in one sense, it's simple because we're aspiring to deliver a great outcome using technology. On the other hand, it's highly complex because really what we're doing is unpicking the purpose of the building and then understanding where and why we could deploy any given technology, and then think about how we bring them all together as an integrated whole. So, I think, it's a complex space, but I think as an industry, we're starting to understand that, the banner smart buildings does have something that we can all start to sort of create and align together with.
Yeah, I understand why it makes you cringe, but we also need to start somewhere, right? We need a name. We need to name things, and sometimes there are new things, and people come up with all creative names. But what are, from your point of view, the main technologies that enable a building to become smart, and what's the difference between a smart building and a traditional building?
Yeah, look, I think so. If we said a traditional building has a number of systems in it, but they're deployed separately, then the difference with a smart building is thinking about how we can bring those systems together. So the very first component of that is actually understanding how we want them to communicate. What sort of network do we want to deliver in order to enable them to communicate with each other and also to communicate with other systems or solutions that we might bring in under the banner smart? Hot on the heels of that connectivity is, of course, security. Once we start to bring all the systems together on, typically today what we call an ICN, an integrated communications network, then yes, we have the convenience and the reliability of a more robust network, but we've also really got to make sure that's well secured. So connectivity followed by security is the starting point. Then we have to look at the question of what are we doing now that we've enabled these systems to communicate? In some cases, what we're doing is we're actually enabling individual systems to just communicate directly with each other, particularly where we need, extremely real-time, extremely low latency interaction. It's typically going to be best to do that direct between systems. But what we're also looking at, of course, from the smart perspective, is the data from the systems. So the information that can allow one system to better understand conditions and respond to them. And look, a classic example here is, we have occupancy sensors, we have building management system. By enabling the occupancy sensor data to be shared with the building management system, that can then better understand why this meeting room has got hot. If we overlay, say, room booking information with that, we can see that, yes, there are 20 people in a room designed for 16 people, but we can also see that the booking only goes for another 20 minutes, and after that, the room is empty for the day. So that's kind of that principle of making data available and enabling it to be shared. However, it's really easy to say making data available and enabling it to be shared, but that's the next part of the architecture, is actually saying what technique, what method, what system or systems will I use to get the data out of the individual systems, bring that data to a common environment where I can share it, and also make sure that data is structured in a manner that it is relevant and accessible and usable by those different systems. And that even comes back to really simple stuff or basic stuff like the expectation for consistent data naming. But coming back to my point before, it's not very helpful if I have the BMS referring to room 1.01, the occupancy sensor referring to room A.01, and maybe the room booking system referring to Benelong or whatever it might be. So that's one of the key elements in terms of actually enabling that smart. First we've got that connectivity and that security, but then secondly, it's bringing the data together, and not just bringing it together so it's in a common place, but in a common and structured way. And of course, this is where I see a really nice parallel actually with the journey that we've been going on in the digital construction side of things, because there, for large projects. We talk about the common data environment and so on, and the structuring of that information in the design phase. Really, we need that same discipline, albeit with a different focus in the operational phase. So you've got the connectivity, the security of that, the data acquisition, the management, and then we get to the point as well saying, we're not just enabling those systems to communicate together, we also want to be able to introduce new applications. And I use that as a broad term, but I guess the reason I use that broad term applications is to differentiate from a fairly abused term in the market, the platform. We've seen a lot of cases where people talk about one smart platform, but the challenge if you build that as one big structure where all your smart functionality lives is that you live and die by the quality of that whole platform. Yeah. Whereas if I have a data environment and I can then introduce different applications to it, I can start to pick what suits me, both in terms of budget, but also in terms of the evolving market. And that's a key point I'd emphasize as we go through this, is we're not in a place where you can just say, okay, smart buildings have matured, there's nothing left to, nothing left to evolve, you can just pick from everything. We're in a place where even over the life cycle of the project, you may start out with an aspiration for, a particularly sophisticated occupancy analytics function that maybe doesn't exist today. But perhaps in the 3 years through to your build, it comes into existence. So that's why I really advocate for that idea of applications that might be about security, occupancy, fire safety, energy optimization, building systems analytics. That allows you to really think about the functionality you need in each case, buy only what you can afford or you can justify, and remain adaptable. So if you want to swap one of those applications out at a future time, you've actually contemplated how to do that. Rather than having one monolithic platform where effectively I have to sort of piecemeal upgrade that if I actually want to enhance it.
Yeah, I love this approach of splitting the data schema, the database, and the different applications. It makes a lot of sense. It's a lot more scalable and future-proof, I would say. We know that the smart buildings have created a lot of opportunity from the, for example, energy efficiency point of view, the sustainability side. But from your point of view, how can we use smart buildings to minimize energy consumptions while at the same time we maintain the comfort of the occupants in a building? Yeah.
And look, I think this is one of the parts of the market that I point to as really an example for other less mature parts. So we're seeing now that you can buy a variety of solutions depending on what your particular focus is. If you just want to optimize your central plant, there are solutions for that. If you want to go out and look at your broader, building mechanical system and the way in which it's performing, the conditions to which it's responding, and you want to optimize that, both in sort of response, controls, perspectives, but also possible faults that are affecting the system and making it less efficient, you can do those things as well. And the people who have developed those various solutions, in conjunction with the clients they've worked with, have recognized, just like you say, that it is no good to try and just sort of run the system hard as possible while not achieving those thermal comfort outcomes. So it's really, we're seeing that mix of both. And this is a theme I'll come back to probably again and again through our chat. But even in that space, it's really worth just understanding what is the value you're pursuing. There are already capabilities with, whether you want to call it AI, machine learning, similar, but automated solutions that are just going to work the closed loop of the plant function as efficiently as possible within the parameters you give them. But that solution might not have any context for the fact that there's a fault out in the field, which is resulting in much higher demand, which is then affecting the overall performance. So that's where we might look more at a FDD and maintenance optimization type of solution. But even there, we've got choices as well as to, do I have a facilities management team who are probably more at that management layer rather than that engineer layer? And what they want is, to identify work orders that should be issued, make sure the work's completed, etc. So they want kind of that more structured solution providing recommendations. Or perhaps I have, really strong engineering team on site, and what they need is just better tools to help them to diagnose and plan. So even in that context, we're talking about that idea of efficiency and optimization, thermal comfort, and so on. There are various solutions in this space, which means it's good because you can choose what suits you, but it also means you have to understand what suits you. So I think that's a really important theme there, because we do see still, unfortunately, people sort of saying, I want to buy something that's building analytics and energy optimization, and they haven't really gone further than that in terms of how they think it will fit into their workflow, how they think that their existing organization, their FM team, their engineers, their BMS provider, and so on, are actually going to interact with that solution to make it effective.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And we know that over the last few years, the different organizations and companies have been, and engineering firms have been talking about sustainability goals. Has been really front of mind for the industry. Do you see a role for smart buildings to help organizations meet this footprint and sustainability goals?
Absolutely. Yeah, look, I think, one of the great things about an energy optimization solution is that obviously you're reducing your consumption. You're reducing your power bills, which everybody likes from a financial point of view. That's great. But you're also getting this flow on to reducing your potential carbon impact. So I think that, and for me, that's a great example of getting the best from a sustainable approach. We still have this case where people are like, oh, sustainability, it's cost and so on. But here we're actually really bringing the merit of both together. We're saving energy and cost, and we're reducing carbon impact. And so, I think, and obviously besides anything else, we are waking up as a culture, as a civilization globally, we've realized that we've got problems in climate change and so on. And so increasingly, regardless of where you stand on the stance of true belief in sustainable outcomes, it's actually just becoming good business sense. Already has become, I would argue, good business sense. So I think that imperative is there, and that makes it much more attractive then to go, look, we can get wins in a couple of categories here. And if you think about that point where we're saying we're going to optimize the performance, again, let's just talk about the thermal environment, the conditioning of the air and so on. I can get a cost win, I can get an experience win, and I can get a sustainability win. And that's a great thing, because I do think, to compare and contrast, unfortunately, there is quite a lot of tech out there searching for a value, searching for a proposition, searching for a use case. It's like, well, if we just get these IoT sensors that do blah, blah, then something good will happen. And that unfortunately has tainted the industry to an extent, because people are a bit sick of that, blind optimism or that undirected enthusiasm. So I think, look, sustainability, absolutely. One of the other things that I really like from a sustainability perspective, or in conjunction with the broader principles of sustainability, is the health and well-being aspects. So remembering again, and you won't hear me talk about data centers, you won't hear me talk about logistics warehouses, etc., because what I'm really passionate about is places with lots of people. I love that experiential side of things. I love the idea that we're helping people to have a better day at work, or better learning experience, or faster recovery in hospital, whatever it might be. In that context, we then have the experiential well-being tech, things like ambient audio. So, we've gone through this generational piece where we made mechanical systems quieter. Then we discovered that their noise was quite handy for, acoustic privacy. So then we went through a phase of injecting noise back into buildings, which I always thought was a little bit crazy. But now we're coming to a point where we can say, well, actually, okay, we do need that baseline background sound level at around that sort of 45 dB in order to have sort of acoustic comfort. But we can do that with more natural sounds, which help to reduce stress, help to make us feel better, because, for millennia, we've been outside for a lot of our lives, and now we spend a lot of our lives inside. So that's a real passion for me as well, in terms of not just that pure sort of what I almost call the hard sustainability of things like energy reduction and carbon and so on, but that consideration of the indoor environment, things like the ambient audio, also things like circadian lighting. And I think one of the things I love about the smart buildings process is that when we're talking about that aspiration, we're really giving ourselves license as a project team to explore all the different areas where we could have an impact. Whereas if we started from with a lighting specialist, or an audiovisual specialist, or an ICT specialist, or security, or mechanical, or whatever, I'm kind of always driving towards that solution, the hammer looking for a nail. Whereas we try and flip that around and say, well, what is the genuine value we could deliver? And then how can we achieve that with those different systems?
Yeah, this is great. And yes, I like how you are thinking about the occupant as well of the building. when thinking about how they can personalize the experience for themselves and how the building actually adjusts itself to the people that live in it. I think we can also think about smart buildings as a way to improve productivity as well, because if my experience is better and I'm in the best environment possible, what do you think about that? Do you think that smart building can also help improve productivity of people?
Look, I definitely think it can. I think it's quite a challenged area to prove. So it's, you have the ROI category of solutions, like I can save cost, I can therefore save carbon, I can buy less offsets, etc. But there are some things, and productivity is an example, where it can be difficult to prove that metric. That's so it's almost like, I think we have to be quite clear when we're going through that process to say, here are our ROI-based solutions, because I can point to the fact that, if I implement this, I'll reduce that much cost, or, make my building more profitable in some other way. And then we've got this other category, which in some cases are hygiene things. Like, for example, although I said that connectivity is really important, it's hard in isolation to point to an ROI for a network. Because the network itself is actually enabling other functionality. So I think that's one of the important parts of this process, the smart building process as well, is saying, are you going after an ROI with this solution? Or are you going after something else in terms of that, experience improvement and so on? And do you have a way to measure the enhancement of that? Coming back to your point on productivity, I think one of the very simple metrics that I perceive is occupancy. People go to places they value. As long as we have a choice, you can tell what we value, because that's where we go. If we're told we just have to go to the office, or, I work, for example, in a specific function, like in a hospital or similar, where I have to be physically there, then there's not so much indicative choice. But today, particularly when we think about workplaces, you can actually tell by the amount of time that people are electing to spend in that space. And that comes down to not just, did I go to the office today, but, was it meeting rooms? Was it desk space? Was it other collaborative areas that were really seeing that demand? And of course, you can then start to look at tying that back to perhaps the productivity of individual teams and so on. But I guess that's where we have to be mindful as well of the complexity of data. As we start to say, okay, well, we see lots of this team is turning up, and we can also see that maybe profits up or whatever else, perhaps retention metrics have improved and so on. It's not always easy to prove the correlation or the causation between those things. And I think that's a big challenge for smart buildings generally. As you get into the data space, you have to be diligent. You have to recognize that just because two things happened at the same time doesn't mean that one of them caused the other, and doesn't even necessarily mean they're related. So that, for me, productivity is a great example of that. Yes, there are ways we can potentially demonstrate that, but particularly in the knowledge economy, it can be hard to draw that direct correlation between what I did with the building and a definite business outcome.
Yeah, makes sense. And there is also another aspect that is interesting for smart building, which is the aspect of safety and security, and how the data that we collect also could create some privacy concerns as well, right? Because we all want to make sure that our buildings are safe, and we are monitoring who is accessing. We potentially could scan the faces and do face detection. We could use biometric access control, lots of different things that we can use. So from your point of view, how can, on one side, improve the buildings, the security of the buildings, at the same time make sure that we address all of the privacy concerns that people may have?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think, there's a few different facets there. Obviously, part of the smart buildings kit bag is access control, is CCTV, is video analytics. There are various elements there that absolutely are being used to manage and improve the safety of the building. And again, you could be doing that just with those systems, not in a smart buildings context, but in a smart building, in an integrated connected building, I obviously have opportunity to create more connections between those systems, whether it's about, badging through speed styles and some other function happening as a result, it could be lifts or similar, whether it's about video recognition, whether it's also then about things like the ability to detect abandoned baggage and so on, or to detect rubbish. There's various different functions that we can unpack there. But as you said, privacy is a key element. And I think, again, this comes back to understanding that we're in a different world when we contemplate all of this data we can bring together. You know, you have a category of data which is very much sort of, I'll call it building centric. You know, it's about what's happening with the energy consumption, with the air conditioning, maybe with water consumption, lighting conditions, whatever else. But then there's a category that's very much occupant centric, which is about how people are using those systems, the individual identities and so on. And like you said, you do have to be quite careful in thinking through how you will manage that data. And that comes back to this point about, bringing all the data together in a common environment. We need to be really clear about where that data potentially does have privacy implications or security implications. And I think one of the things we're seeing there is the opening up of new areas, new opportunity for services in the industry, because typically somebody who is not familiar with data, as they start to engage with it, will find this is quite bewildering. This is possibly even so confusing that I don't know what to do with it. On the other hand, if you bring somebody from a data perspective to building data, they may well very clearly understand how to work with the data, but they may not have any context on what it means from a building perspective. So there's a real challenge there around actually understanding how you will use data, not just from a systems perspective, but also from an organizational perspective, from a governance perspective. And I think, again, the answer there is, if you go in with your eyes open to that, then you can make plans, you can identify gaps in your organization, either in the project phase or in the operations phase, and you can resolve those gaps, whether it's hiring people in, whether it's outsourcing certain functions, all of these things can be addressed, but it's really having that awareness from upfront to understand the implications of what you're doing.
Yeah, it makes sense. Another interesting aspect of smart building could be how they can help from the maintenance point of view. We know that we are familiar with this way of maintaining building that could be very reactive. So a building manager identifies an issue and now we react to the problem. So do you think that we can use smart buildings to prevent maintenance issues before they actually even occur? And that could probably lead to cost saving as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think predictive maintenance is another good example of something that everybody wants to see. We can't necessarily do it in every aspect yet, but certainly there are cases where we can say, okay, look, I can be pretty sure of an activity that's going to need to happen. And if I give you a specific case, let's think about, there are various things under the banner of maintenance. Cleaning is a maintenance activity. If I know the occupancy and the use of things like desks or meeting rooms or any other kind of area, then I can better understand the likelihood of needing to actually clean that area. If I've got sensors on my bins, I can better understand the fill rate of bins and so on, and I can respond to that. Equally, even as an example, if I just know that there is actually a thermal issue in an area, I may not be able to predict what the activity is that I need to do to solve that issue, but I'm at least aware of it before I get a tenant complaint. So there's a few different categories there of being able to say, I definitely know that there's an activity that needs to be done. It's cleaning, it's bin emptying, it's addressing a thermal issue or similar. I can also start to see patterns, and again, coming back to building analytics, I can see scenarios where perhaps equipment is degrading. That may predict that there's a failure, or just again, it may not be an absolute failure. It may be that there's a filter that needs changing, or perhaps there's a valve that's stuck open, things like that. So I can go and I can look and I can address those kind of issues. So yes, definitely that kind of capability is starting to come to the fore. But the really important thing to remember is, in the vast majority of cases, these solutions don't fix the problem themselves. You have to integrate it to your workflow. You have to integrate it to the whatever contracts you have in place, be that cleaning, be that your BMS maintenance cycle, be that, whatever other aspect. Because if you have alerts, but you have no person to respond to them or no mechanism for that work to be instructed, you're not much better off than when you didn't know about them.
Yeah, that's true. We talked about smart buildings, but let's try to think about how we can scale up this concept of smart building to the broader vision of the smart cities. How can we integrate smart buildings into a larger smart city infrastructure, and how can different buildings share data between each other and with the city systems?
Yeah. Look, I think That's been a perspective of mine for a while now. Particularly, I mean, I've always been a buildings person. That's probably come through in the kind of examples I've given and so on, but I've mostly been about buildings or maybe precincts. And so while I've spent time looking at and working in some of the smart city areas, one of the things that has always struck me is that they are assemblages of buildings. So yes, there are some smart city, smart community elements you can use, which are separate to the building components, but it's really important. If I'm building a smart building, I don't want it to be a smart island. I want to think about how it can communicate with other buildings. Now, I think we're still kind of heading towards that future. I don't think we're quite there yet in many cases, but definitely there's the opportunity there for us to be able to say, I can not only leverage the benefit inside the building, but I can look at how I can beneficially share information between buildings. That could be about power consumption, power generation, for example. So it might be about local exportation, as it were, of energy between buildings. And again, you see this in microgrids within large precincts like health and universities and so on. But extending that thinking to city centre areas and again, communities and so on, there's definitely opportunities there to connect what you've done with your smart building to what you're doing in your smart, broader environment. I think, though, the one thing I'd say is that amplifies this challenge of getting things like data naming and data structure and communications and protocols right. Because if that's hard to get right for one individual building, you make your choices about what combination of, BACnet, Modbus, and OPC and MQTT and whatever else you're going to use, and then your database preferences and so on. But you then also have to think about, well, how do I align that to the building next door, the building down the street? It may well be owned by somebody else who's gone through a different design process at a different time as well. That's the other point. It's not often that we just build an entire, neighborhood or district or whatever at the same time. So we really have to have that awareness of what those interactions might be and a level of requirement to say you must do this. Because let's also not forget, for any given project at any given time, the program's under pressure, the budget's under pressure, we've got more aspirations than fit either of the former two. So if we then lob in something helpful like, and your data has to be available for the broader smart city, it's not going to get very far if that's not structured, if it's not mandated in some way, or if it's not attractive in some way.
Yeah, we are close to the end, but before we go, I would really like to touch about an important topic, which is user experience. Because at the end of the day, Pete, it's all about the people that actually use the buildings. But you were probably aware that there are many complaints about user experience that people have with actually using smart technologies. So why do you think we get so many complaints about this technology at the moment? What's going on?
Yeah, look, this one goes right the way back to the beginning of my journey, as I mentioned, in AV. One of the things that stood out for me early on was that we didn't really seem to understand our users. And you'd hear a lot of complaints about, this touch panel doesn't work, this video conference system is too complicated, it's unreliable, etc., etc., etc. A lot of that came back to the fact that very broad assumptions were being made by project teams. And they're saying, we know best, we're the experts, we know how to design this. And very rarely did they interact at all with the users. And in fact, even we saw circumstances as I was starting to sort of push through this space in the mid-2000s, even circumstances where you were technically engaging with the client, but not necessarily the people who actually were the users in the room. And a client representative would say, I know what's needed. I know what's required here. I had one particular example where basically we were told that all 52 functions need to be presented in equal sized buttons on the main touch panel page. And the person said, because I know where they all are and I can use them easily. The problem with this, though, is they were not the sole operator. So when other people came in and they wanted to operate the system, they were presented with, 50-odd buttons. And, it's a bit like when you look at the remote control, you're like, now, where's that menu function again? Or how do I get to the guide? And so we have this situation where if you don't engage with the actual users, you will never find out, A, what's really important to them, B, what makes sense to them, and C, kind of the level of sophistication that they want. Because almost always, the level of sophistication the actual user wants is a lot less than the specialist engineer or designer who has been creating the thing. And that includes whether I'm talking about as a consultant, whether I'm talking about the contractor, the programmer who's actually doing the work. All of these people bring so much expertise in the area and often overthink stuff. With the very best intentions in the world, you're putting too much stuff in. I think Steve Jobs said a great quote, which I won't trot out exactly right, but basically it was that, simplicity is actually really hard to get to. Complexity is easy. You can deliver a complex solution fairly easily because you don't have to refine it much. You just give people all the functions, give them their 52 buttons, let them work it out. Whereas simplicity, you actually have to be really clear on what the core functions are, what the right workflow is, what the user journey is. So I'm going to drop a few terms here because I think they're often missed. So you've got the user interface, which technologists are pretty familiar with. We design the touch panel, the button panel, the web UI, the dashboard, whatever it might be. That's the UI. But that by itself doesn't tell us anything about how it works. We need two key components to help us have that reference. The first is the user experience. So that is how I navigate through my interaction with those devices. And the second is the user journey, which is really important. And that's the question of why did I come to the panel or the web page or the, whatever it was in the first place? What brought me here today? What is my role? Am I, a lecturer? Am I a corporate chief in a boardroom? Am I the executive assistant to the corporate chief who's got to get the video conference up and running? Am I working in maintenance? Am I, managing the BMS, whatever it might be? Why am I here? What is my role? What have I got to do next? So user journey gives you that context. User experience then says, okay, I've come to the panel. What functions do I need to complete? Do I, for example, get nervous if I press the button and it doesn't seem to do anything? Do I need some feedback to tell me because actually the function is going to take 10 seconds to respond, but I need to know that it's doing it rather than, it didn't work. And then finally, the user experience, which actually manifests those functions. This is applicable to basically every technology. At the end of the day, in some way, we interact with tech. And again, I'll highlight BMS. I've been doing a fair bit of work over the last few years in that space around the context of smart building systems and so on, just from the UX perspective. Just saying, okay, well, hang on a minute. What do we actually want the BMS graphics to present for? Who are my categories of users? What are they going to do as a result? And again, very similar to the audiovisual world where people have had a lot of hate for AV interfaces over the years. BMS, we see very similar things. And again, I think part of the issue there is there are several cohorts of users, but we don't necessarily think about all of them. We've got the engineer technician, which is fairly well covered by the fact that we've got this technical cohort of designers. We've also got the facilities management cohort who really are sort of in the red-green category. They've got KPIs. They need to keep the building running. They need to know how many things are green, how many things are red, and then be able to take some steps as a result, including calling our technician cohort to help them solve the problem. And then separate to that, we've got our executive cohort or analyst cohort who aren't doing either of those things. They're looking at, analytics trends. They're looking at forecasting. They're looking at general performance, possible strategic scenario modeling and so on. And you can pretty easily imagine if I give one interface to those three cohorts, nobody's going to be happy. And yet in too many cases, that's kind of what we've seen is sort of the one interface to satisfy everyone. So user experience is absolutely key from my point of view. The good news is it's reasonably straightforward to actually start delivering better user experiences. So the very first step is find some users. Actually ask that question. Where are my users? Do we know if these users exist? If you can't actually find the specific users because they haven't been hired yet, this is common in some new facilities. The whole ops team doesn't exist yet because the building's 3 years away. What you can do is find representative users. So you can go and interview people who do similar roles and so on. Depending on the organization, you might have some of those people available. They might not be moving into that building, but they might have an equivalent function. So find users. And then use user experience design thinking processes, ideation to iteratively engage with them to really get clear and say, okay, we now understand what's desired. People always get a little bit scared about this because they say, oh gosh, what if the users ask for something outlandish that we can't afford? But that's actually part of the management process. As you go through that journey, it's not saying like, imagine you could have anything you want and somebody decides, I don't know, they want a theme park or something. It's more setting the context. Hey, this is going to be a lecture theatre. This is the broad functionality that we're expecting to deliver. How would you work with this? Or this is going to be an operating theatre system, or this is going to be a courtroom system. How does that align to the way the court works? I can't tell you how many times I've had experiences in those kind of contexts where somebody says, well, it does all these things, but that's just not how we work. And I refer to that as technically correct, but functionally rejected. Technically it does a thing, but it's not the thing the user wants. So, yeah, for me, particularly with the complexity across smart buildings generally, with dashboards, with analytics platforms, even with like the question of exporting data somewhere else, what is that user journey? How do I make sure that the user interface that enables that is effective? Or if I've got an automated method, again, that it aligns to that overall user journey. So, I think for me, if I could bring no other improvement to the industry, I'd have that focus on user experience, because it actually drives through a lot of the other things that we need to improve.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Pete. I think the problem comes from the fact that the engineering industry is familiar with having a problem. So if you're an engineer, somebody throws a problem at you and you find the best way to solve it. Yep. This is more like product management, product design skills, where you don't even know what the problem is yet. So you need to figure out what the problem is. You need to speak with the people, the users, the people are going to use the thing you are about to design and build. And only then you solve the problem, but you still keep on touching base with them to make sure that you are actually solving the problems that they have. Otherwise, you end up building a solution looking for a problem.
100%. I mean, if I give a super quick example about how you can do this without kind of introducing just sort of infinite project risk, let's take, say, an operations center environment. We know when we're going to build that building that we're building it to be an operations center, or, a significant part of it is, it could be an airport, it could be for an emergency service, could be for a telco provider, could be for transport, any of those categories. We know that there's a really important asset or situation that we have to manage. So that's our first iteration. That's why we're building the building. There is no question. We're not going to, do it in a tent or, I don't know, out in the open air or whatever else. It's going to be in a building. So our first iteration is then just asking, so how will the people work in that building? And some of this is very much, as you said, it's more like architect as opposed to engineer territory. But as I then go through it, I go, okay, I understand the number of people, I understand the kind of functions. I can now start to understand the kind of specific space. And this comes to, things like these very large video wall systems and potentially a lot of data coming into them. In many ways, those ops centers you see are like an enormous smart building platform. They're a smart system. They're bringing data from all sorts of places, from cameras, from whatever else, and consolidating them. So then I can get to the point where I understand how many people need to be in the space. That can define the extent of the displays. I can understand where the data is coming from. So I'm really building that up. I haven't changed the fact that it's going to be a building. I've consolidated on how many people. I've got an idea of how they're going to work, and so whether they need one big screen or smaller screens, bigger screens, whatever. And then I can come down to the point of, then how do the people interact with that system? So I just iteratively sort of tighten the loop so that I'm dealing with smaller problems as I go. I'm no longer asking, is it an ops center? I'm no longer asking, are there 50 or 500 people here? I'm no longer asking, what's the palette that we need for the working environment? Now I'm just asking within that context, what is the best way to configure it for how people want to work? Do I want, an app on the desktop for everybody? Do I want an app on the desktop for team leaders? Do I just want a touch panel that enables me to interact with those solutions? And that kind of process is what allows us to constrain that iteration. I think people get scared about the idea of iteration because, like you said, in software product development, you kind of just keep going. You keep iterating and you have releases and so on. Whereas in construction, at some point, we've got to finish. We've got to finish designing so that we can contract. And then B, at some point, we've got to finish building so that we can hand over. And I think it's actually, the tension between those things that we have to resolve. But like I say, it is eminently resolvable. And if we approach that environment, be it that kind of complex sort of ops center example I gave you, be it just more broadly thinking about smart building functionality, then we can work through that process. And the one thing I'd say in closing with that, some people say, gosh, that sounds like hard work, etc. Well, it kind of is, but it's less hard work than leaving it till later. We've all heard the point before about, like, if you have a discussion and you realize you've got something wrong in the discussion, it effectively costs you no dollars because you just go, oops, sorry, let's fix that. If you realize when you've written the report and it's being checked that there's an issue, well, maybe that's like a $10 issue. If you realize when you've produced the document set and it gets recalled, then that might be, $100 or $1,000 issue. If you realize when you hit site that there's a problem, then it's potentially a $10,000 or $100,000 or $1 million problem. And what we're talking about here is similar. If you do that work up front, you can solve when it's cheap to fix the issue. If you wait for it to manifest as a problem or an uncertainty on site, all you're doing is allowing it to cost more and take longer.
Totally. The importance of embedding all of these processes during all of these exercises during the design process. But we are at the end of our episode today, Pete. This was a great episode. Thank you very much for making the time for meeting me and have a chat about smart buildings. If people want to reach out to you, where can they find you? I know you are on LinkedIn. I know you are you are a speaker. You are in so many different places. But what's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, look, absolutely on LinkedIn. You'll find my details there. I would also advocate, if you're interested in smart buildings and you're not yet a member, you should really have a look at Nexus Labs. That's a great community. I also work with ERA currently on their big data special technical group, so you'll find me there if you're in that sort of space. But yeah, absolutely, LinkedIn's a really easy one. And as I say, Nexus Labs is a great community. If you want to know more about smart buildings, you want to immerse yourself in that world, then do go and find nexuslabs.online.
Thank you very much, Pete. This was great. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Andrea.